This one really grew on me. When I first tried the Polyend Tracker, it struck me as clever but clunky. It had a lot of cool stuff that it brought to the table, but I had a hard time making anything listenable on it. I went out of my way to learn its different features, and something just wasn't quite clicking, so I left it alone for a while, and something strange happened. I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was calling me. When I finally picked it back up, I was able to lean into its specific workflow and strengths, and it all just kind of clicked. Its interface and features interact in a really interesting way, and that's what I want to try to get across today. For those of you unfamiliar, the Polyend Tracker is a standalone, step-based 8-track monophonic sampler, much like the Innovation Circuit Rhythm or Electron Digitact, both of which I've reviewed on this channel. I'll link those at the end of this video. Like those other devices, each track on the Polyend Tracker can only play one sound at a time, but you can switch between multiple sounds on a step-by-step basis. There are a few different ways to enter notes. You can record parts in live by hitting record and then play, like that. You see how it dumps everything onto one track. And you can do this both quantized, like I just showed you, or unquantized, which is super nice. You can record in sample or instrument mode, like I just showed you. Or I can switch to note. And now I have all of these notes to work with. And fun fact, if you hold down the note button, this will show you which notes correspond to which pads, and you can change the scales and keys that these pads are mapped to. Overall, I initially kind of hated how small they are, but I did at least get used to them. The recording process is fairly standard and painless, although there is one weird quirk that I'll get back to in a little bit. But overall, it is really nice to have hands-on live recording on a tracker, and that's one of the primary differences between the Polyend Tracker and the Dirty Wave Mate Tracker. The other big differences, of course, are size and the sound engines. The sound engine in the Mate is quite a bit more powerful with dedicated synthesis modes, whereas the Polyend Tracker is more focused on samples and sample manipulation, but I'll get into the Polyend Tracker's sound engine in a second. This is not meant to be a comparison video, I just wanted to at least briefly mention that. The other way besides recording that you'll be entering notes is using the step sequencer. So you can scroll to notes, hit record to punch in a note, or I could stay in record mode and tab around. So here's what I've got now. You can enter stuff rapid fire while in record mode. This is especially great for hi-hats or arps or things like that. Or scroll around with the arrow keys. You also have 2 columns of effects, which cover things like note repeat. Let me go to roll here. Or also probability, velocity, so you can have fluctuating note volume. You see how it'll just take the last one that you gave it, and you can swap them out. And if you like the unquantized feel but don't want to record unquantized, you can also use these to scoot notes forward or backward in time. There's a lot of stuff to dive in here, and I don't want to take up the entire video showing you how in-depth the sequencer gets, but I really like how everything is all laid out. If you've used something like the aforementioned Digitact or Circuit, this process will actually be fairly familiar to you once you get used to the vertically scrolling interface. And even that is actually not really that difficult. And the benefit is that it allows you to see all of your note values, all of your sample selection, and all of the parameters of those individual steps all at once, which is really nice. It does take some getting used to the process though, because it's mildly slow and very deliberate. Once I accepted that, I actually started to enjoy it. There are things to make it faster, like note preview and note fill, which I rarely use. But regardless, you are encouraged to take your time with it and think things through a bit, or just punch stuff in wild experimentation. But like I alluded to earlier, it's not without its quirks. And by far the most annoying one is how it deals with off steps. Essentially, if you just punch in a bunch of notes, each note will cut off the previous note. So far, so straightforward. That's pretty much exactly what you'd expect. But if you want to end a note sooner, you can enter in a step that just says off, and it'll stop that note. Once again, that seems fairly straightforward. But that causes some weird interactions when you start to play stuff in live and when you start to program stuff. Because if you play stuff in live, it will insist on adding note offs every time you release a key. Watch this. You see how it added those off steps? And if I try to record in between notes that don't have note stops on them, it will just refuse. I very obviously hit a note here. I triple checked that I actually pressed it. I made sure that this track is armed and unmuted, and then it just refused to add a note. But then if I add a note stop, let's try that again. Now it worked. That is fine. You can get used to that, but good lord did I think my unit was bugged until I figured that out. Once I figured out how smaller details like that work, the system grew on me a lot. And like I mentioned, I love that you can see everything laid out all at once, and you can have these interweaving parts where you can see how the notes interact with each other in a fairly unique way. After a while, you stop seeing an impenetrable spreadsheet and you just start seeing your notes and their parameters. To be clear, this is not for everyone, but if you have some experience with step sequencers, I think you might actually pick this up faster than you expect. Next up, let's get into sampling and sound shaping capabilities. Loading in your own sounds is as easy as just dragging audio files or folders of audio files onto the micro SD card, which you then access via the sample loader. And you can get into individual folders that easily, preview sounds, all that kind of stuff, and to see how much project memory the samples that you're loading into the active memory are taking up. There's also an audio input for recording samples directly in. I should also mention that you can sample the radio, which is always a fun feature to have. That is inevitably going to draw comparisons between the Polyend Tracker and the Teenage Engineering OP1. And to a degree, I get it. They're both portable, sleek devices with certain step sequencing abilities and the ability to sample the radio, but the OP1 and the Tracker are very much not alike, in my opinion. They're super different because the OP1 has the tape machine gimmick where you can freely record stuff onto its simulated 4-track tape machine. Yes, it has step sequencers that you can record into the tape machine, but overall, your experience is pretty free flow, and in that way, a bit more DAW-like, whereas on the Polyend Tracker, you are restricted to the step sequencer and the grid. You can definitely get similar results on both devices, and they're both pretty portable and all that kind of stuff, but they're very different experiences. And I wouldn't necessarily say that the Tracker is the OP1 killer, or for that matter, that the OP1 is the Tracker killer. That being said, let's get back into the sample loading. The sample loading process is also fairly deliberate, like a lot of the processes on the Tracker, because you have to dig through your folders and make sure you've got another slot loaded up, preview your sound, you can add next. So you are encouraged to take your time with it. It's a bit of friction up front, but it's also not any different from a lot of other similar devices. So I'm not going to criticize this for that necessarily. I should also mention that once you've brought a sample into a project and processed it with all the stuff I'm about to show you, you can then save that whole instrument with all of its processing and load that into other projects as well, which is super nice. I also briefly mentioned sample chopping, which you also get in sample playback. I've done beat slice here and I can adjust those chops however I want. And you'll notice the filter on each individual chop because if I go back to my pattern, if I choose an instrument, that one sample will contain all of my chops. If I go into note mode, rather than playing it chromatically, it'll play the chops. And I've done processing via instrument parameters with cutoff and resonance and ADSR, overdrive, and all that kind of stuff. But let's jump back to choosing an instrument. Now I've got this synth stab selected to show you all of the different parameters that you have access to shape your sound and kind of turn it more into a synth or just to sound different in general. Or let me go back in here and crank the resonance and crank the overdrive. And the bit crusher, which is great. And you've got reverb and delay sends. You have dedicated controls for that reverb and delay if you go into the master, which is also just how you get to the mixer. So here's your reverb setting, your delay setting, and you can see how I've built up muscle memory over time. I typically prefer grooveboxes without a screen, but I do quite like the way they've used the screen here. I think it's an old school vibe, and it still talks pretty well to the built-in buttons, even if occasionally some stuff is a little bit reliant on your memory to navigate. So far, I've shown you basic sound shaping with filters and envelopes. Like I mentioned, there are also LFOs to shape that stuff, and there's an entire other menu for sample playback, including Wavetable and Granular engines, which are fairly basic, but really fun. And you see how it scrolls through here. You can even smooth out the different stages of the wavetables, which is really nice. Once you've taken some time with them, you can get some pretty cool results, although it's definitely hit or miss depending on which samples you feed both engines, and often they end up sounding like the audio equivalent of a migraine, but with some experimentation, you can get some cool results, like this. So far, a lot of the stuff I've been talking about in terms of sequencing and sound shaping has been, it's a little weird, but I've grown to like it. The big exception is the sidechaining, which is a little weird and I don't like it. So here's that beat that you heard in the intro, except not processed in post at all. So let me just demonstrate what annoys me about the sidechain. So if I go into my master and set my sidechain track to track 1 and turn down the limiter threshold, I just have a lot of trouble getting a clean result out of this. And the limiter will just apply to everything except for the track triggering the sidechain. So if you wanted to have, say, some hi-hats not affected by your kick and snare track, too bad. It's going to sidechain everything. And I just don't love the way it kicks in. I've had a lot of trouble getting it to sound good. So I would much rather export all the individual tracks, which fortunately is super easy on this. I can just export either the song stems or the pattern stems and bring them into my DAW, work with them, which is exactly what I did with the beat you heard in the intro. And I much prefer that to working with the built-in sidechain. I don't love it. The tracker is a weird device to try to review because it's a niche device that is absolutely not for everyone, but is also not nearly as intimidating as a lot of people might be tempted to think. For me personally, I spent a lot of time steeped in step-based groovebox workflows, getting eased into it with the Novation circuit, and eventually deep diving into the Polyend Tracker and the Dirty Wave Mate. At this point, spreadsheet type beat is just part of my brain and it's not going anywhere. But at the same time, despite having made a lot of progress into getting into the workflow, I still have a bit of a harder time than normal making something listenable on the Polyend Tracker. Maybe it's due to the more deliberate workflow and me still needing some refinement in that, or maybe it's due to the sound engines sometimes being rather scratchy and aggressive if you push them too hard. But regardless, I'm still really glad to have the Polyend Tracker in my studio. And if you are as deep into the step-based groovebox niche as I am, I think you'll find something to enjoy here. Anyway, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see reviews of some other step-based groove boxes, you can click or tap up over here, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching.